For centuries, many biblical scholars have argued that the book of Genesis contains two different creation accounts. But many Christians who have read their Bibles find this idea to be very perplexing. But what clues do scholars point to in the text to support this idea? And what if Genesis 1 and 2 really are two different creation accounts? The first clue that many scholars point to is the order of creation. In Genesis 1 through 2-3, you have earth, light, sky, land and seas, plants, celestial bodies, animals, man and woman. In Genesis 2, 4 through 25, you have earth, water or mist, the man, plants, animals, and then the woman. The first major difference between the accounts is in the first account, plants come before man and woman, but in the second account, plants come after the man but before the woman. Additionally, in the first account, animals come before man and woman, but in the second account, animals come after the man but before the woman. There have been several responses to this where you try to reconcile the differences, such as some people will argue that the second account zooms in on day 6 where man is created. But personally, I find many of these explanations to be a stretch, and oftentimes you have to interject things that are not in the text to make the pieces fit together. A second clue that scholars look to is a transition marker in Genesis 2:4. Genesis 2:1 through 5 reads, "Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation." Verse 4, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth, when they were created, in the day that the Lord God made the earth and the heavens, when no bush of the field was yet in the land, and no small plant of the field had yet sprung up. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the land, and there was no man to work the ground." In verse 3, we see that it says that God rested from all the work that he had done in creation. So this seems like a firm stopping point to the first account. But even stronger than this is that verse 4 has a phrase, "These are the generations of." This phrase, "These are the generations of," or in Hebrew, toledoth, is often pointed out to be a transition marker that the author of Genesis uses to transition between new sections in the book. And here are the examples in the book of Genesis. You have, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth." In Genesis 5:1, we have, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." In chapter 6, the generations of Noah. Chapter 10, the generations of the sons of Noah. Chapter 11, the generations of Shem, and then the generations of Terah. In chapter 25, the generations of Ishmael and Isaac. In chapter 36, you have 2 mentions of the generations of Esau, and then in chapter 37, you have the generations of Jacob. Now, some of these may not seem to be big transitions in the story of Genesis, but the biggest one to me is Genesis 11:27, because Terah is the father of Abraham. Even though chapter 12 of Genesis in our English Bibles starts with the call of Abraham, Abraham's story starts before in Genesis 11. So far, we have seen 2 clues that scholars point to. First, the difference in the order of the accounts, and second, this phrase, "the generations of," which seems to be a marker that occurs in between the 2 creation accounts. Another huge difference that people will point to is the portrayal of God. In Genesis 1, you have a God who's transcendent. He's powerful because he speaks creation into existence. He is shown as orderly by creating in a pattern of 6 days and then resting on the 7th day. And then he's also majestic. The portrayal of God in Genesis 2 is similar, but it does seem like God is more immanent and hands-on. He's talking with Adam, he's placing him in the garden. Instead of observing creation from the outside, he's interacting with it. Like an earthly potter, God forms man out of the ground and breathes life into his nostrils. The final clue that scholars discuss is perhaps the most convincing and the one that gets talked about the most. In Genesis 1, the Hebrew word Elohim Elohim is the name or title that is exclusively used for God. So in verse 1, in the beginning, Elohim created the heavens and the earth. However, in Genesis 2, God is always referred to as Yahweh Elohim. So the personal name of God, Yahweh, that's later revealed to Moses, is added to Elohim. And in translations, you will often see this as Lord God with Lord in all caps. Interestingly enough, the first use of Yahweh Elohim in Genesis is in Genesis 2:4, the verse we looked at earlier that contains the transitional phrase, the generations of, which again reads, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created, in the day that Yahweh Elohim made the earth and the heavens." In summary, you have four main pieces of evidence that scholars use to argue that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 contain two different creation accounts. You have the order of events is portrayed differently in both accounts. Genesis 2:4 contains the transitional phrase, the generations of. How God is depicted is vastly different in both accounts. And finally, God's name in Genesis 1 is Elohim, and God's name in Genesis 2 is Yahweh Elohim. Perhaps you are not convinced that there are two creation accounts in the book of Genesis, but let's pretend for a moment that there are. What would this mean, and what would this not mean? First, this does not mean that the documentary hypothesis or other similar theories are necessarily correct, although I would argue that this would provide evidence for one of those views at least. It also would not mean that Moses did not write or compile the text. So those who want to maintain Mosaic authorship could argue that Moses wrote down the stories even though he may have compiled them or got them from different sources. Lastly, this doesn't mean that Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 contradict each other. Instead, this means that the author or compiler of the text has a different intention for those who will read the text. But if this is true, it would mean that there were two different creation stories, possibly from different origins, that were placed together side by side in the book of Genesis. This also means that the differences are there for a reason and are something that we should pay attention to. The more I study the creation accounts in Genesis, the more I'm convinced that the main point of them is not to tell us how God created the universe, but instead its primary purpose is to tell us who God is and who we are. When we take both accounts together, we see this beautiful tapestry of who God is and who we are in His eyes. So God is transcendent and personal. God is majestic and accommodating. He's powerful and relatable. And at the same time, we are the pinnacle of creation, but also servants. We are made in the image of God, but we are also caretakers of the world around us. So in the end, when we take these two accounts together and don't try to minimize the differences, I think what we see is the picture that God intended, that we serve a God who is wholly independent from us, but is also the one who cares enough to relate to us on our level.